My name is Harold Pierce, and at 64 I thought I had already survived the worst a family can throw at a man. I was wrong. "Pay the $80,000, my son said over the phone, his voice flat like a business call. "It's your responsibility. If you won't, don't come to the wedding." He didn't stumble, didn't hesitate. In the background I heard a woman's quick laugh, the clink of glasses, the comfort of a life I had helped him build. His fiancée, Autumn, had clearly rehearsed this speech with him. Every word landed like a neat little knife. $80,000. Not a request, not a conversation. A command, wrapped in the word responsibility, as if being his father meant I was nothing more than a line item on his budget. No mention of my pension, my back, the years I'd spent working doubles while he slept under my roof. For a moment, anger pressed hot behind my teeth. I could have reminded him who packed his school lunches, who sold his car to cover his mother's chemo, who skipped meals so he never had to. I could have begged, argued, shouted. Instead, I smiled. He couldn't see it, but I let that smile settle until the anger cooled into something far more dangerous. Clarity. If my son was willing to ban me from his big day unless I paid for the show, then I finally understood my place in his new life. I was done playing it. Before I tell you how I turned my son's rooftop wedding in Atlanta into a lesson he will never forget, take a moment to support this channel. Hit subscribe, tap like, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from so you don't miss what happens next. The weight of a lifetime has a strange way of settling into memory, not as a neat sequence of events, but as a collection of moments that reshape the ground beneath my feet. As I look back, I can almost trace the slow drift of my son away from me, each distance carved by choices I made out of love and choices he made out of ambition. When Lucas was young, I believed effort alone could protect him from the realities I faced. After my wife passed, I moved through my days with the mechanical steadiness of a man who had no choice but to keep going. I took every shift I could manage, patched up meals from whatever was cheap, and kept the bills from drowning us by sacrificing whatever comfort I had left. There were nights I returned home too exhausted to speak, but I still sat beside him as he finished homework, pretending my mind was not already fraying at the edges. I wanted him to grow up untouched by the noise of financial strain, convinced that shielding him would give him a future I never had. For many years, I thought it worked. He excelled in school, earned scholarships, stepped into the professional world with confidence bordering on brilliance. Yet with each success, he seemed to shed pieces of the home that raised him. The small apartment where I counted coins for groceries turned into a relic he avoided. The family stories, once grounding and warm, became sources of embarrassment he tried to distance himself from. The more polished his surroundings became, the more he recoiled from any reminder of where he came from. When he introduced Autumn as the woman he intended to marry, I sensed immediately that she belonged to a world I had never set foot in. Her grace was smooth, her voice measured, her posture built for photographs rather than conversation. She carried herself with the certainty of someone who never had to think about consequences. What struck me most was how quickly Lucas adapted to her rhythm, as if he had been waiting his entire life for someone to validate the identity he wished he was born into. I watched him adjust his speech, his taste, even his values, slipping into a persona that had little space left for the man who raised him. The divide widened when Autumn began building her image across social platforms, curating moments of luxury to shape the perception of their life. Lucas followed her lead eagerly, attaching his worth to approval, metrics, and polished aesthetics. I started noticing the subtle ways he pulled away from me, declining dinner invitations, shortening conversations, hiding the truth behind increasingly hollow reassurances that he was just busy. I recognized the signs not because I was intuitive, but because they mirrored the ways people once distanced themselves from me when I could no longer offer what they wanted. My sister Denise only added to the strain. She had always seen me as the less accomplished sibling, the one who made choices she considered failures. When she saw the life Lucas built with Autumn, she reinforced the idea that I owed him continued support, insisting that parents should compensate for their shortcomings through financial generosity. Her comments sharpened the lines already forming between us, turning ordinary disagreements into quiet resentments. Then there was Marcus, a familiar face from Lucas's childhood. He had once spent afternoons at our home, devouring snacks he never thanked me for and treating me with the casual familiarity of a boy who saw me as a substitute adult when he needed one. As an adult, he aligned himself with Lucas's ambitions, speaking with the confidence of someone who believed association alone made him valuable. He echoed every opinion Lucas wanted confirmed, and I realized he served as a mirror, reflecting the version of my son that excluded me entirely. I sensed that his loyalty would fracture the second it stopped benefiting him. These were the building blocks of the distance that would later justify demands I never imagined hearing from my own child. Each sacrifice I made became invisible as Lucas's world grew brighter and mine dimmer in his eyes. I did not resent him then. I only felt the faint ache of someone witnessing their importance fade from the life they helped build. Nothing dramatic marked the moment he stopped seeing me as a father and started seeing me as an obligation. It was a gradual erosion, the kind that leaves a man standing alone before he realizes the ground beneath him has already crumbled. The next sign that something was deeply wrong did not arrive with raised voices or accusations. It appeared quietly on my computer screen, arranged in clean fonts and polite formatting, as if courtesy could conceal the shape of the blow it carried. I am not a man who lives online, but I keep an old laptop for basic things, paying utility bills, checking my pension deposits, answering the occasional message. That morning, I opened my email out of habit more than intention. Near the top of the inbox sat a new message from Lucas, flagged as important. The subject line contained no greeting, just a string of words that looked more like a receipt than a note from a son. Inside, the body of the message was brief and transactional. Attached, he had added several documents: contracts, itemized estimates, payment schedules. There was no warmth, no acknowledgement of the conversation we had recently endured, only links and numbers, as if he were forwarding materials to a finance department rather than his father. I clicked on the first attachment and felt my chest tighten. The file was a breakdown of costs for the rooftop venue in downtown Atlanta, the place they had chosen to showcase their new life. Rental fees, catering, bar packages, floral arrangements, lighting, sound, each line assigned a precise value. Next to a large total at the bottom, my name appeared as the primary payer, listed in bold type as if I had personally authorized the commitment. Seeing Harold Pierce tied to a sum that could have bought a modest house in another state did something to me that no harsh word ever had. I had been an afterthought in the planning, but here, on paper, I was the foundation. The entire spectacle rested on the assumption that I would quietly shoulder the cost, that my consent was inevitable, a formality rather than a requirement. Curiosity sharpened into unease, and I opened the next document. This one detailed a proposed payment plan through a line of credit. The terms were written in dense language, but certain phrases stood out even to my tired eyes. Joint liability, secured against income, automatic withdrawal. Again, my name appeared beside identifiers that suggested more than casual involvement. There was mention of a pre-approved account, of prior authorization. I felt a cold prickle along my neck as I realized this was not a simple invoice handed to me after the fact. It was a structure already built on top of my identity. I closed the laptop for a moment and sat very still. I tried to recall every form I had signed over the years, every favor I had granted in the name of helping my son. At one point, after he graduated and moved to the city, I had agreed to be an emergency contact on several documents. Later, when he leased his first apartment, he asked me to review some paperwork, and I had signed where he pointed, trusting that he would not place me in harm's way. Those decisions, made in good faith and fatigue, now pressed against me like a closed door whose hinges I had unknowingly installed myself. The weight of my ignorance felt heavier than any financial number on those pages. It was not just that Lucas expected money. It was that he seemed comfortable arranging my involvement without explanation, as if my signature were merely a tool he could retrieve whenever it suited him. The realization settled in slowly. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a pattern that had finally taken a clear, undeniable form. I knew I could not untangle this alone. There is a community center a few bus stops from my home that offers free consultations for seniors. I had passed their flyers countless times, never imagining I would step inside for anything more serious than a blood pressure check. That day, I brought printed copies of the documents and asked to speak with someone who understood financial contracts better than I did. They introduced me to a financial counselor named Karen Liu, a quiet woman with attentive eyes and a calm presence that made it easier to lay out my situation without collapsing into shame. I handed her the stack of papers and watched her read in silence. As her gaze moved across the pages, her expression shifted from neutral to troubled. She took her time, and I forced myself not to fill the quiet with excuses. When she finally looked up, she did not speak to me like a helpless old man. She addressed me as someone who needed facts. She explained that the line of credit tied to my name exposed me to significant risk, that if payments were missed or debts expanded, collectors would not be interested in family dynamics or intentions. They would see only the signatures and the legal obligations attached. She pointed out clauses that made it clear I had been positioned as a backstop, the safety net beneath someone else's reckless jump. As she spoke, I felt a mixture of humiliation and relief. Humiliation because I had allowed myself to be used this way without fully understanding the mechanisms involved. Relief because someone was finally naming the danger I had sensed but could not articulate. Karen outlined practical steps, placing alerts on my credit profile, revoking prior authorizations, sending written notices to any institution that believed it had permission to draw funds in my name. She emphasized that I was under no legal duty to subsidize a wedding, no matter what anyone claimed about tradition or responsibility. The law did not see me as an obligated payer. It saw me as a person who had the right to protect his own stability. Hearing that distinction lifted a burden I had carried so long I almost believed it was part of my body. When I left the community center, I carried a thin folder of printed instructions and a heavier understanding of what had been done behind my back. The files Lucas had sent were not simply requests for help, but evidence of a structure built on the assumption that I would remain compliant and uninformed. For the first time, I saw the situation not just as a father, but as a man standing at the edge of a trap he had been guided toward one careless signature at a time. I walked home knowing I could not change how my son viewed me, but I could change what access he had to my life. That shift in perspective felt small on the surface, almost invisible, yet it altered the direction of everything that would follow. I began the next steps with a clarity I had not felt in years, as if the ground beneath me had finally settled, after a long period of quiet trembling. What I needed most was information, complete, unfiltered, and freed from the interpretations that others might impose on it. The situation surrounding the wedding had already shown me how easily assumptions could be weaponized, how quickly a narrative could be shaped by those who wished to protect their own convenience. I could not afford to move forward blindly again. My credit reports were the first evaluation I requested. I enrolled in monitoring services that allowed me immediate insight into any attempt to use my identity. Each notification felt like a checkpoint in a guarded corridor, a reassurance that I was no longer walking through the financial world with open pockets. For the first time, I saw my history laid out in precise lines and dates. The old mortgage, the pension distributions, the small store accounts I had closed long ago. But nothing related to the wedding appeared, which only deepened my suspicion. Whatever had been prepared was still in motion, waiting for the final trigger that I refused to provide. Once the protections were in place, my attention turned to the people who surrounded Lucas, the ones who had a stake in the image he wished to project. It occurred to me that his fiancée, Chloe Sutton, had far more influence over him than he ever acknowledged. I had seen the subtle shifts in his tone when she entered a room, the way his decisions aligned with her preferences, even when they contradicted his own nature. I could not blame her for the power she held. People grant influence to those they are determined to impress. But I needed to understand how deeply her ambitions reached. To gather context, I revisited public pages, professional profiles, and the polished glimpses she offered to the world. Her updates painted a life curated with practiced precision: fitness routines, charity events, rooftop gatherings filled with people wearing expressions of cultivated aspiration. She positioned herself as someone ascending a ladder that had no room for imperfections or setbacks. No wonder my presence had been treated like an inconvenience. I represented the version of life she believed she had already escaped. I studied the patterns in her posts, the timing of her announcements, the rhythm of her social displays. Each piece helped me understand that the wedding was not just a ceremony, it was a declaration of status, a stage on which she expected everything and everyone to perform perfectly. Lucas, in his eagerness to fit the mold she required, had reshaped his expectations of me as well. What startled me most was realizing that the financial blueprint I had examined earlier carried her imprint as clearly as his. The extravagance matched her aesthetic, not his upbringing. Their partnership had merged their ambitions into a single consuming force. Still, I knew that watching from a distance was not enough. I needed first-hand accounts, insight from people who knew the dynamics better than I did. Without warning or expectation, a name resurfaced in my memory: David Marsh, a former coworker who had spent years handling risk assessment for corporate clients. He had retired before me, but his understanding of manipulative financial structures had always been sharper than mine. If there was anyone who could help me interpret the subtleties hidden within the documents, it was him. I reached out with a simple message, unsure if he still used the same contact information. When he responded later that day, agreeing to meet, I felt a small shift inside me, a reminder that trust, when placed carefully, could build bridges rather than traps. I brought the printed copies of the credit-related materials, the documents from earlier, and notes I had gathered from my research. David approached everything with methodical precision. He examined the papers carefully, making small annotations, looking for inconsistencies that might reveal unauthorized actions. His evaluation confirmed what I had feared. The structure was designed not only to secure my involvement, but to disguise the extent of it. He pointed out certain sections that appeared intentionally ambiguous, places where someone with partial access could have inserted assumptions about authorization without triggering immediate alerts. He explained that institutions sometimes relied on implied consent if someone close to the account holder provided certain forms of information. That meant the danger had not passed, simply because I refused to pay the requested amount. The machine built around my identity had gears that could still turn, especially if someone was determined to activate them. Once David finished the assessment, I understood the full scope of the situation. This was not about money alone. It was about control. Who held it, who surrendered it, and who believed they were entitled to it, regardless of the damage done to others. I had been positioned as a silent participant, a placeholder meant to absorb the consequences of decisions made without my knowledge. Leaving his home, I carried only the folder and my resolve. I would not allow my identity, my retirement, or my remaining years to serve as collateral for anyone's ambitions. The path forward was no longer about uncovering the problem. It was about severing the ties that made the problem possible. And with each step I took, the distance between who I had been and who I needed to become grew clearer, forming the boundary that would define everything that came next. A subtle shift in the air marked the next stage of the unraveling, not loud or dramatic, but undeniable in its direction. I sensed it through the scattered signals that reached me from different corners of the city, small signs that the momentum behind the wedding machinery had begun to falter in ways no one inside their circle had expected. The first indication arrived in the form of a notification from the monitoring service I had enrolled in earlier. It alerted me to multiple attempts from unfamiliar vendors trying to verify account details tied to upcoming transactions. Each request was redirected into a block that prevented further inquiries, and seeing those entries listed in sequence created a quiet, steady confirmation that the safeguards were working. The protection was doing what it was designed to do, and that alone shifted something inside me. It reminded me that I was no longer reacting to their plans. I was actively preventing the next step they depended on. As the day unfolded, more disturbances echoed through the invisible channels surrounding the event. I heard through indirect sources, people who floated between social groups, neighbors who lived closer to the activities, and acquaintances who kept loose connections with the couple, that unusual calls were being made. Some vendors reportedly questioned missing confirmations, while others mentioned delays that threatened their tightly arranged timelines. A florist wondered aloud why a final payment link bounced twice. A lighting crew supposedly paused their setup after being told that approval codes were temporarily unavailable. These details reached me piece by piece, but each fragment created a larger silhouette of what was happening beyond my sight. I did not feel triumph in those moments, only a measured steadiness. The consequences they were experiencing were not the result of malice, but of a boundary I had reinforced after years of being expected to remain pliable. Protecting myself was not cruelty, though I knew they would interpret it that way. I understood the likely emotions on their side: panic, frustration, disbelief, but the choice to respect my autonomy had not been theirs to override. Later, I became aware that the final rehearsal at the rooftop venue had experienced unexpected interruptions. Someone who happened to be present mentioned that equipment arrived in incomplete batches, with several services citing incomplete authorizations. I could picture the tension unfolding in that room, not in a spirit of schadenfreude, but in recognition of how heavily their plans relied on assumptions of seamless cooperation. When those assumptions collapsed, the facade cracked quickly. Chloe's role in all of this surfaced again through the curated lens she offered to the world. Her posts became less frequent, replaced by brief updates that hinted at last-minute adjustments. Though she did not reveal the core problem, subtle changes in her wording suggested strain. A sentence about navigating unexpected challenges with grace stood out as a thinly veiled attempt to retain composure. Reading it, I sensed how deeply this event mattered to her image, how invested she was in presenting a flawless ascent into the life she had curated publicly. As for Lucas, the pieces of information that drifted my way painted him in a state of growing urgency. People who had contacted him described him as overwhelmed, switching between forced optimism and visible frustration. I imagined him standing in the midst of half-completed arrangements, trying to hold together a structure that had already begun to separate at its seams. The pressure of external expectations, combined with the financial burden they had attempted to anchor to me, would have been immense. I did not relish his struggle, but neither did I feel responsible for alleviating it. Watching events shift in this way brought a peculiar sense of distance. I was no longer part of their equation, no longer the foundation they had expected me to be. Removing myself from the structure allowed me to examine it more clearly. What struck me most was how fragile the entire system had been from the beginning, woven from aspirations that depended too heavily on performance and too little on genuine support. The more I reflected on this, the more a quiet clarity settled inside me. Years of bending to preserve harmony had created an unspoken assumption that I would always step in when needed, regardless of how I was treated. Breaking that pattern felt like stepping out of a shadow I had not realized I was standing in. When that day drew to a close, I carried with me not the weight of their unraveling, but the understanding that decisions made in silence could be powerful. I did not know how they would respond next, and I felt no urgency to anticipate it. What mattered was that I had reclaimed the space to act on my own terms, something I had not allowed myself in a very long time. There was a distinct stillness in the morning of the wedding day, not the peaceful kind, but a tense quiet that suggested something was about to shift. I sensed it before any news reached me, the way one feels the weight of an unseen storm approaching. It was the sort of silence that carried an edge, as though the day itself understood it had been built on foundations too flimsy to hold. My decision to remain distant kept me anchored in my own home, yet fragments of the unfolding events traveled toward me through various channels. People who passed by the venue, acquaintances who moved within the broader social circle, and individuals who simply observed what large gatherings tend to expose. Each new detail that reached me painted a clearer picture of the chaos unraveling at the rooftop site. From what I gathered, the earliest disruptions began as the venue staff prepared the space. The arrangement teams anticipated a strict timeline, but the absence of certain vendors pushed the schedule into confusion. Some crews reportedly waited for confirmations that never arrived, while others simply did not appear. Without those coordinated efforts, the rooftop that was meant to be transformed into an immaculate display remained a patchwork of partially assembled elements. Equipment stood in scattered clusters, unused and visibly out of place. Guests started arriving much earlier than anyone had expected, perhaps due to the publicity surrounding the event. They encountered an atmosphere of disarray the moment they stepped through the entrance. The rooftop, which had been chosen for its sweeping skyline and aspirational aesthetic, no longer resembled the stage Chloe had envisioned. Instead, it echoed with the subdued conversations of people trying to understand why the preparations were incomplete. Those who knew the couple well seemed especially unsettled, unsure of how to interpret the unusual state of the venue. Some sought staff members for answers, while others hovered near decorative pieces that appeared half-installed. A few individuals attempted to reassure themselves that the delays were minor obstacles, a temporary inconvenience, rather than evidence of a larger breakdown. Yet their expressions betrayed doubts they were unwilling to articulate. I imagined Chloe navigating that environment. Her identity depended heavily on precision, control, and the presentation of perfection. The disorganization would have struck at the heart of her carefully cultivated image. Reports suggested that she moved through the rooftop with an expression that grew increasingly strained, making decisions rapidly and attempting to compensate for missing elements. The effort to preserve appearances must have felt like holding together a structure already splitting at the seams. As for Lucas, the fragments of information I received carried a different tone when they referenced him. People described him as overwhelmed by the weight of unmet expectations, moving between attempts to reorganize and moments of visible frustration. It seemed he realized too late that the arrangements rested on a financial framework that no longer existed. Without the contributions he had assumed would materialize, the entire operation became a sequence of complications he could not conceal. The most striking accounts of the day involved the arrival of certain guests who noticed the absence of essential vendors, caterers who had withdrawn, photographers who never confirmed their attendance, musicians who lacked the necessary payment to proceed. Their absence wasn't subtle. It created voids that could not be ignored, and those voids turned the event into something resembling an abandoned set rather than a celebration. At some point, observers noted a shift among the crowd. Conversations changed from polite curiosity to whispered assessments of what might have gone wrong. When expectations are built on grandeur, their collapse attracts attention. People began to distance themselves, both physically and socially, from the unfolding failure. Some guests reportedly left before the scheduled start time. unwilling to attach themselves to a moment that had already slipped beyond repair. I felt no satisfaction when I heard these descriptions, only a solemn recognition that the consequences had followed the path set in motion by their own decisions. The wedding had been crafted as a display of status, one that depended entirely on external validation, yet it crumbled under the same scrutiny it invited. As the day progressed, the accounts became quieter, as though people no longer knew how to interpret what they witnessed. The event did not resolve with dramatic closure. Instead, it simply lost structure. Whatever vision they had hoped to project dissolved into scattered movements, unfinished tasks, and the quiet dispersal of attendees. From my distance, I understood that the collapse was not a single moment, but a gradual realization shared by everyone present that the celebration had never been rooted in stability. Watching it unravel through the accounts that reached me, I felt the certainty that my decision to step away had been not only necessary but inevitable. In the weeks that followed, the noise surrounding my son's failed celebration slowly faded from public conversation, but its consequences did not dissolve with it. They lingered quietly in the background of ordinary days, reshaping lives in ways that no one had planned for when they decided a rooftop spectacle was worth the risk. I learned, through indirect channels and the slow drift of information that passes from person to person, that bills tied to the event did not vanish, simply because the day had fallen apart. Invoices remained, payment schedules persisted, and institutions that had extended credit expected accountability. The absence of a functioning ceremony did not absolve anyone of what they had signed up for. Lucas began receiving calls from collection agencies, each one a reminder that agreements had consequences beyond embarrassment. Missed payments tightened around him like a net. A credit report that once reflected upward momentum now carried marks that would shadow major decisions, applications for housing, business arrangements, and future financing. The life he had tried to accelerate using borrowed leverage was suddenly constrained by the same mechanisms he had treated casually. Chloe faced a different kind of reckoning, her identity built so carefully on the perception of control and refinement was challenged by whispers that traveled through professional networks and social communities. Sponsors reconsidered their associations, not because an event failed, a setback can be relatable, but because the failure exposed a pattern of overextension tied to image. In her world, where appearances were a form of currency, any hint of instability made collaborators more cautious. Even extended relatives were not shielded. My sister, Denise, who had championed the idea that I owed it to my son to uphold tradition no matter the personal impact, found herself caught in the backlash of her own opinions. Those who once nodded along with her criticisms began to question the fairness of her expectations when they saw the damage more clearly. People she expected to side with her grew quieter, unsure whether her insistence had contributed to the harm rather than prevented it. I heard, too, that Marcus, who had attached his ambitions to Lucas's trajectory, encountered obstacles as negotiations tied to their joint ventures stalled. Partners grew wary of instability, of anything that suggested poor judgment in managing risk. It was not that one ruined event destroyed entire futures, but it illuminated tendencies that had long been overlooked. The picture of reliability they had tried to project now contained fractures that were difficult to ignore. As for me, I took deliberate steps that had nothing to do with punishment and everything to do with self-preservation. I met with an attorney who specialized in estate planning for older clients. Together, we reviewed documents I had not touched in years: beneficiary designations, powers of attorney, emergency contacts. I removed Lucas from positions that would grant him influence over my affairs, and adjusted my will so that whatever remained after my death would not automatically flow toward someone who saw me as a financial instrument rather than a person. Some allocations were redirected toward organizations that supported caregivers and patients facing the kind of illness my wife had endured. It felt fitting that resources I had once tried to stretch for her benefit would eventually serve others in similar battles. The rest was left in simple, modest structures that required no complicated explanation. I wanted what I had left to reflect values I could stand behind without hesitation. On quieter days, I settled into routines that had nothing to do with crisis or planning. I took walks, cooked familiar meals, sat with the kind of stillness I had not allowed myself when work and worry consumed my schedule. There was grief in acknowledging the distance between myself and my only child, but there was also a sense of relief in no longer pretending that the bond was healthier than it truly was. One afternoon, a piece of information reached me that complicated my understanding of everything that had happened. Someone I knew mentioned that Chloe had shared a long reflection online, not framed as an apology, but as an attempt to process what she called a public and private failure. Out of curiosity rather than hope, I found the post and read it carefully. She wrote about expectations placed on parents, about the blurred line between support and entitlement, about how easy it is to treat older relatives as obligations rather than individuals with their own limits. She acknowledged, in careful language, that leaning on someone's history of sacrifice can become a way to avoid examining one's own choices. At the same time, she hinted at feeling abandoned, suggesting that boundaries can feel like betrayal when they are enforced for the first time. Reading her words, I recognized a kind of conflict she was not ready to resolve. She seemed to oscillate between insight and defensiveness, between recognizing that something in their approach had been deeply wrong and wanting to preserve a narrative in which she had only ever reached for what she believed was possible. There was no direct mention of me by name, but the outlines were clear enough that I could see myself in the spaces between her sentences. Her reflection did not move me toward reconciliation, yet it did offer a different angle on the story. It showed me that even those who appear entirely self-assured can be forced into uncomfortable introspection when the structures they rely on fall apart. Whether she or Lucas chose to change as a result of that discomfort was beyond my control and outside my responsibility. I did not respond to the post. I did not reach out to either of them. The distance I maintained was not driven by anger anymore, but by a recognition that some lines, once drawn for survival, should remain in place. Protecting my remaining years from further harm did not require their understanding, only my commitment. If there is any lesson in what unfolded, it is not about the satisfaction of watching someone else's plans collapse. It is about the cost of allowing your worth to be defined solely by what you can provide, and the quiet power of saying no when that definition becomes the only one others are willing to see. Whether my son and his wife-to-be ever come to fully grasp, that is their journey, not mine. I live now with the knowledge that love does not always mean continued access, and that stepping away can be an act of dignity rather than spite. What anyone chooses to learn from that, if they choose to learn anything at all, is a question that no longer decides the shape of my life.